There is a place on Earth where the stones do not make sense. Not in a small way, not in a way that a little more research might clear up. They do not make sense in a way that makes archaeologists go quiet, that makes engineers stop mid-sentence, and that makes the most careful historians choose their words very, very carefully. It sits at nearly 13,000 feet above sea level, higher than most mountains in Europe. The air is thin, the landscape is empty, and scattered across this cold plateau in the Bolivian Andes are the remains of a structure so precisely built, so mathematically exact, that some of the world's leading stoneworkers have stood here and said, plainly, that they could not replicate it today, not with hand tools, not even with modern machines set to the same tolerances. The place is called Puma Punku, and the question that has followed this site for over a century, the one that mainstream archaeology has never fully answered, is this: who built this, and how did they do it with tools that should not have been able to do it? That question has no comfortable answer, and the more carefully you look, the more that discomfort grows. According to mainstream history, Puma Punku is part of a larger ancient site called Tiwanaku, a pre-Columbian civilization that flourished in the Andes roughly between 500 and 1000 CE. That is the accepted window. Just over 1,000 years ago, give or take. The Tiwanaku people are described as skilled builders and engineers, a complex society that had organized labor, religious architecture, and agricultural systems. Their civilization eventually collapsed, possibly due to drought, possibly due to internal conflict, and left behind stone monuments that would remain largely undisturbed until modern researchers began to study them seriously in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is the official story. It is not wrong exactly, but it has gaps, and those gaps are significant. The first gap is the most basic. The Tiwanaku people had no writing system. They left behind no records of how Puma Punku was built, no instructions, no diagrams, no descriptions. What we know about their methods is inferred, and in many places, that inference requires us to accept engineering feats that strain credibility, given the tools and the context. The second gap is harder to ignore. When early Spanish chroniclers arrived in the Andes after the conquest and saw the ruins of Tiwanaku, they asked the local people about the site. The answer they consistently received was that the structures had not been built by any living civilization, that they were already ancient ruins when the Inca arrived. The Inca themselves, whose own empire began around 1400 CE, reportedly told the Spanish that Tiwanaku was built by giants in a time before memory, before their time. This raises an important question. If the site was built between 500 and 1000 CE, as the current timeline suggests, why did the Inca, and who came after, describe it as impossibly ancient? Were they simply being poetic? Or did they know something that our timeline does not fully account for? The official story does not fully engage with this question, and it is just one of several places where, if you look closely, the explanation stops short. Let us talk about the stones themselves, because this is where the conversation becomes difficult. The blocks at Puma Punku are not rough-hewn. They are not the kind of approximate stonework you see at most ancient sites. Large rocks shaped by human hands into workable but imperfect forms. These blocks are something else entirely. Many of them are made from red sandstone and grey andesite. The andesite is particularly significant. Andesite is an extremely hard volcanic rock, harder than the copper and bronze tools that the Tiwanaku people are believed to have used. When a stone is harder than your tool, cutting that stone with precision is not simply difficult. It should be functionally impossible by conventional standards, and yet the cuts are there. Perfectly straight lines, interior right angles, grooves that run without deviation, holes drilled to consistent depths and diameters, flat surfaces that, when tested with a straight edge, hold contact across their entire length. In the 1990s, engineer and researcher David Childress published measurements of the H-shaped blocks at Puma Punku that suggested these stones were manufactured to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. Some accounts from visiting stonecutters and engineers suggest that the internal angles of certain blocks, those precise 90-degree corners in the interior channels, could not be replicated with hand tools regardless of patience or skill. The geometry requires a different kind of process. There is also the matter of scale. The largest blocks at the site weigh between 130 and 440 metric tons. One particular block, sometimes called the Plataforma Litica, is estimated at 440 tons. It was quarried from a site approximately 10 kilometers away. Some of the andesite may have come from a quarry near Lake Titicaca, more than 90 kilometers distant. Moving a 440-ton block across rough Andean terrain at altitude without the wheel, the Tiwanaku are not believed to have used the wheel for transport, raises questions that current explanations address only vaguely. Theories involving rope, wood rollers, and large organized labor forces have been proposed, but no one has successfully demonstrated in practice how such a block could have traveled that distance and been placed with the precision we observe. The stone is harder than the tools they supposedly used. The tolerances are tighter than hand tools can achieve. The blocks weigh more than anything similar that has been moved without machinery. All three of these facts exist in the same place. Any one of these details in isolation might be dismissed as exaggeration or misinterpretation, but all three together, at the same site, in the same structures, raises a question that deserves a better answer than the ones currently offered. The questions surrounding Puma Punku did not begin recently. They have been circling in academic and engineering circles for well over a century, and the pattern of how those questions have been handled is worth examining carefully. Arthur Poznański was a Bolivian-Austrian archaeologist who spent decades studying Tiwanaku, beginning in the late 1800s. His work was meticulous, even obsessive. By analyzing the astronomical alignments of the Kalasasaya Temple, a major structure at the broader Tiwanaku complex, and comparing the declination of the solar alignments to known changes in the Earth's axial tilt over time, Poznański arrived at a deeply controversial conclusion. He believed Tiwanaku was not a few hundred years old. He believed it was closer to 17,000 years old. This was not a fringe claim made in passing. Poznański worked with the German Astronomical Commission in the 1920s, submitting his measurements and calculations for independent verification. The Commission's response was measured but significant. They agreed the astronomical alignment suggested a date far older than the accepted timeline, though they did not fully commit to Poznański's specific figure. The mainstream archaeological response to Poznański's work was largely dismissive. His methods were criticized, his conclusions were labeled speculative, and his age estimates were set aside. The accepted date of Tiwanaku was anchored instead to ceramic analysis and carbon dating of organic materials found nearby, neither of which directly dates the construction of the stone structures themselves. This is a distinction that rarely receives attention, but matters enormously. Dating the pottery found at a site tells you when people were using that site. It does not tell you when the stones were cut and placed. These are potentially very different moments in time. Poznański was not alone in his unease with the standard timeline. Peruvian archaeologist Federico Kaufmann Doig noted in his own work that certain architectural features of Tiwanaku suggested a level of technical sophistication inconsistent with the accepted developmental history of Andean civilization. He too found his conclusions met with institutional resistance. What we observe across the history of Puma Punku research is a recurring pattern. Researchers who question the timeline or the technical methods are either ignored, marginalized, or quietly absorbed into footnotes while the consensus moves forward. The questions they raised do not receive direct refutation. They simply become invisible. The most honest thing that can be said about the current academic position on Puma Punku is that it answers the easy questions and avoids the hard ones. This is not a conspiracy. It may simply be the natural tendency of institutions to protect established frameworks. But the result is the same. Certain lines of inquiry never receive the serious, methodical investigation they deserve. The deeper you go into Puma Punku, the more the questions multiply, and they do not stay contained to the stones themselves. In 2006, a team of researchers using ground-penetrating radar at Tiwanaku detected what appeared to be a large, previously unmapped complex of structures beneath the surface, covering an area substantially larger than the currently excavated site. The full extent of what lies underground has not been fully explored, and to date, only a small percentage of the broader Tiwanaku region has been systematically excavated. What this means is that the structures we are looking at may be only a fraction of what exists. We are, in a very literal sense, seeing only what has been uncovered. Whatever has not been uncovered remains unknown. Then there are the alignments. The major structures at Tiwanaku, including Puma Punku, are oriented to the cardinal directions with a precision that requires either extraordinary surveying skill or some method of alignment we have not identified. The site as a whole appears to have been designed with an astronomical purpose, oriented to the rising and setting positions of the sun at solstices and equinoxes. This is not unusual for ancient sites. What is unusual is the scale and exactness of the alignment, given the elevation and the terrain. Some researchers have also noted that the construction techniques at Puma Punku bear striking similarities to techniques seen at other ancient sites on the opposite side of the world, sites that were built supposedly by entirely different civilizations with no known contact. At Sacsayhuaman in Peru, just north of Cusco, you find similarly gigantic stone blocks fitted together without mortar, with such precision that a sheet of paper cannot be passed between them. At Ollantaytambo, also in Peru, you see multi-ton andesite blocks cut and placed in ways that defy simple explanation. At the ancient Egyptian site of Abydos, certain stonework in the Temple of Seti the Femme shows a quality of cutting and fitting that archaeologists struggle to explain with the tools known to have been available. Across the Pacific at Nan Madol in Micronesia, vast stone structures built on artificial islands from basalt columns, some weighing up to 50 tons, remain unexplained in terms of construction method. And at Baalbek in Lebanon, the so-called Stone of the South is a single quarried block weighing approximately 1,650 tons. It is the largest known quarried stone in human history. It was never moved from its quarry. No one knows what it was intended for or how the builders planned to lift it. When the same unexplained engineering appears across continents that supposedly had no contact, the same precision, the same scale, the same impossible tolerances, the simplest explanation is not coincidence. What is the connection between these sites? Mainstream archaeology's answer is that there is no connection, that similar techniques were arrived at independently, that humans in different places solved similar problems in similar ways. This is possible, but it is also a position that becomes harder to maintain the more precisely you examine what was actually built. History has a difficult relationship with things it cannot yet explain. For most of the 20th century, the ancient city of Troy was considered a myth, a story from Homer, a poetic invention. Then Heinrich Schliemann went to northwestern Turkey in 1868 and began to dig. He found Troy. He found it buried under layers of other civilizations, each built on the ruins of the last. A place that educated people had declared fictional turned out to be real, and the discovery forced an entire revision of how we understood the ancient Mediterranean world. For decades, the Antikythera mechanism, a bronze device recovered from a Greek shipwreck in 1901, was considered too complex to be genuinely ancient. It contains over 30 precision-machined gears, could predict solar and lunar eclipses, and tracked multiple astronomical cycles simultaneously. Scholars initially assumed it must be a later addition to the wreck. It was not. It is now dated to approximately 100 BCE and is considered the world's first known analog computer. Nothing remotely similar appears in the archaeological record for another 1,000 years. And then there is Göbekli Tepe. Until 1994, the oldest known temple complex in the world was Stonehenge, dated to around 3000 BCE. Then archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site in southeastern Turkey that would overturn that assumption entirely. Göbekli Tepe contains massive T-shaped stone pillars, precisely carved, decorated with sophisticated animal reliefs, arranged in circular formations, and dated to approximately 9600 BCE. That is more than 11,000 years ago, nearly 7,000 years older than Stonehenge. It was built during a period when, according to the prevailing model, humans were simple hunter-gatherers with no organized society, no agriculture, and no engineering capacity. Göbekli Tepe did not fit the model, and unlike Puma Punku, it could not be argued away. The dates were too solid, the evidence too clear. The model had to change, and it did. The discovery rewrote the accepted timeline of human civilization and forced archaeologists to admit that our ancestors were capable of far more far earlier than previously thought. Every generation has its Göbekli Tepe, a discovery that was impossible until the day it wasn't. The question is whether we are patient enough to wait for the next one. These examples matter because they establish a pattern. Not every anomaly is a discovery waiting to be validated. But the history of archaeology is full of cases where the comfortable consensus was wrong, where the evidence was present, the questions were being asked, and the establishment chose to look away until it could no longer afford to. Puma Punku has been waiting in that liminal space, too specific to ignore, too inconvenient to fully engage with, for a very long time. Let us stop here. Let us be precise about what we are actually looking at. The core question at Puma Punku is not whether the site is ancient. It is not whether sophisticated people lived in the Andes thousands of years ago. It is not even whether a civilization capable of organized labor could have quarried, transported, and placed these blocks. The core question is this: how were these specific cuts made? Not the big blocks, not the transportation, not the alignment. The cuts, the interior right-angle channels, the flat surfaces measured in sub-millimeter tolerances, the consistently drilled holes, the precision that exceeds what copper or bronze hand tools can produce in hard andesite. This question has been put directly to engineers and stoneworkers who have studied the site. Their answers vary, but the most technically rigorous among them tend to say some version of the same thing. They cannot identify a hand tool process that would produce these results in this material. Some suggest abrasive techniques. Some suggest lost knowledge of processes we no longer practice. Some suggest the cuts were made in a different way, with a different kind of tool, or in a different state of the material, that the archaeological record does not currently account for. None of these explanations have been developed into a testable, demonstrated method that has been replicated on the same material at the same tolerances. They remain hypotheses without proof, and that is where the conversation currently sits. Modern science can date the site approximately. It can describe what was built. It can propose general methods. What it cannot do, what it has not done, is demonstrate step by step the actual physical process that produced what is sitting on that plateau in Bolivia. And in the absence of that demonstration, the gap in our understanding remains open. We know what was built at Puma Punku. We do not know how. And that is not a minor gap. In engineering, the how is everything. Some researchers have proposed that the answer may involve technologies we associate with far more advanced periods of history: mechanical cutting, rotary tools, or even methods we have not yet conceived of. These ideas are routinely dismissed as speculation, and perhaps they are. But speculation and honest uncertainty are not the same thing. Dismissing a question because its most available answers seem uncomfortable is not science. It is avoidance. The question of how these cuts were made has never been satisfactorily answered. That is a fact, not an interpretation. And it sits at the center of everything we do not understand about Puma Punku. Here is what we know. There is a structure on a high plateau in Bolivia, built from blocks so precisely cut that modern engineers cannot fully explain how they were made. The site shows astronomical alignments that required sophisticated surveying knowledge. The transport of certain blocks required moving hundreds of tons across terrain that presents challenges that have never been satisfactorily resolved. Local traditions going back centuries before the Spanish arrived said the site was ancient, already a ruin, long before any known civilization claimed it. And underneath what has been excavated, there may be more, perhaps much more, that has not been uncovered. Here is what we do not know. We do not know the actual age of the stone structures themselves, only the organic materials found near them, which may or may not reflect the same moment in time. We do not know the specific tools or processes used to achieve the cuts that are present in the hardest stones. We do not know what the full site looked like when it was complete, or whether what we are looking at is a finished structure or an unfinished one. We do not know whether the people who built it were the same people who later inhabited it, or whether they inherited something built long before them. The most challenging possibility, not the most likely but the most challenging, is that Puma Punku is not an anomaly, that it is not a strange outlier in an otherwise well-understood human past, that it is instead a piece of evidence for something larger, a chapter of human history that we have not yet located, have not yet excavated, have not yet named. This is not a comfortable thought. It is much easier to accept that everything about our past is more or less settled, that the timeline is basically correct, that the gaps are small and will be filled in eventually by routine archaeology. That is a reassuring picture. It may also be incomplete. The history of our species contains a period of at least 100,000 years before the structures and cities we know about. 100,000 years of human beings, thinking, building, passing knowledge forward. And yet the archaeological record for that entire span is sparse, fragmentary, and full of silences. We are accustomed to treating those silences as emptiness, but silence is not the same as absence. What if some of those silences contain something? What if the people who built Puma Punku were not anomalous, not a brief isolated peak of Andean ingenuity, but one expression of a much older tradition of knowledge that arrived in the Andes from somewhere we have not found, or from a time we have not yet accepted? What if the stones at Puma Punku are not a mystery to be solved, but a message to be read, and we simply have not yet learned the language? History is not behind us. Some of it is still buried. And some of the most important things we will ever discover about ourselves are sitting in plain sight, in places like a cold plateau in Bolivia, waiting for us to ask the right questions. The structure is still there. It is not going anywhere. And the cuts in the stone are still exactly as precise as they have always been. We are just waiting to understand them.